it is more than just a river. The Volga is a vital line of communication, 3,700 kilometers long. This is Europe's largest river, dividing it from Asia. They say it mirrors the soul of Russia. In the summer of 1942, the Volga becomes the target of Hitler's great offensive in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The Sixth Army advances on the Volga. On the 23rd of August, German tanks reach the riverbank and the city from which there will be no return. Stalingrad.
Oh, what a huge relief. We've done it. Here's the Volga, and we'll get Stalingrad too.
But the illusion of an easy victory dies in the battle among the buildings of Stalingrad.
We could possibly grit our teeth here and not imagine that we weren't going to capture the city. But we were already gripped by this feeling. What in hell is going on here?
The war shows its cruelest face in this industrial city on the Volga. Death lurks behind every wall at any moment. Stalingrad is turned into a mass grave. Towards the end, 1,000 German soldiers will die here, every day.
Many got up out of the trenches. They stood up out in the open and walked towards the Russians. Of course, they'd hardly got over the edge when they were shot. Many of them went to pieces up there.
A battle of despair in which 500,000 Soviet soldiers will die. They must hold Stalingrad at all costs.
The company commander warned us, not one step backwards. There's nowhere for us to go on the other side of the Volga. Hold out until death.
An entire army will be destroyed in the ice of Stalingrad. 300,000 German troops will be surrounded. 2/3 of them die. They will die in battle or freeze and starve to death. Survivors will never forget the scenes of death.
Thousands of soldiers were lying unburied in the snow. Thousands upon thousands. The road ran through them. The wind blew across them. Something is shattered in you. I've said it before. Something inside is destroyed that you can never get back.
The Red Army's shelling puts an end to the German armed forces' invincible reputation. They are making war in the Christmas season of 1942, between life and death. While families enjoy Christmas in Germany as a celebration of love, 3,000 kilometers away on the Volga, it's a matter of survival and of escaping the reality of this murderous war.
Hearing German Christmas carols on the people's radio in this utterly hopeless situation, there was no need to hide your tears. I'm quite sure that many of the men in the Stalingrad division who had forgotten how to pray learned how to do it again.
There is despair in this soldier's letter from Stalingrad.
If only this killing would stop. People at home could never imagine how much we've had to endure. The amount of blood which has been spilt here could never be justified before God.
At home, this agonizing death is stylized as death in action.
And for 1,000 years to come, every German will get cold shivers down the spine when they say the word Stalingrad. And recall that in a way, Germany brought about its own downfall.
This is an obituary to the soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, otherwise known as the Kessel, the cauldron.
We thought, surely they can't let us down. They're sacrificing an entire army. Even to us young fellows, it was inconceivable that they could simply sacrifice 300,000 German soldiers. We couldn't understand it.
As far as Hitler is concerned, it is not human life which is at stake in the Battle of Stalingrad, but above all, his prestige. The Sixth Army wants to surrender, but Hitler refuses. The city bearing Stalin's name must be held. This is Hitler's death sentence for his soldiers in the Kessel. Aircraft are the only way out of the inferno. Some escape death to start a new life. This hope is granted to a handful of men. One of them is Hans Rostowitz.
Suddenly, an aircraft turned in and rolled towards us, where I was standing. It stopped 10 meters ahead of me and stood there. They threw out a few crates and sacks, and we went straight to the plane's door. I wanted to explain to them that I had a bullet wound to the head. Get in, get in! 17 men only! Shut the door! The engines gave a roar, the plane wheeled round and was back in the takeoff position. There were a few more bumps, and then it took off.
40,000 are flown out. The bloodiest, most decisive battle of the war will end in catastrophe and captivity for some 100,000 German soldiers. Only 6,000 will ever come home to Germany, and some will take 13 years to arrive. Their fate characterizes the senselessness of war. There are the same faces the summer before. It was the 28th of June, 1942. German units in the south launch an attack in the direction of the Caucasus. Moscow's defeat in the winter of 1941 seems long forgotten. Hitler's war of conquest in the east continues. The regime calls it a crusade against Bolshevism and Judaism. For the civilians, it's a bloody war of destruction.
We lined up, thinking that we're lining up against Soviet-Russian subhuman creatures. And that's exactly what I mean. We were taught that we were better people than they were.
The armed forces have been part of Hitler's Holocaust for a long time. A non-commissioned officer filmed this, fighting civilians and guerrillas. The spiral of violence widens. How much did the soldiers at the front know?
Thank God we at the front didn't hear about what was happening in the hinterland. That only came during the course of the war. We knew about a year later. I'm only talking about Russia now. It was only then that we heard about the obscenities back there.
But sometimes they become eyewitnesses. In August, a division of the Sixth Army is resting in the Ukrainian city Balazha Zerkov. This is where the SS Special Unit 4A locked 90 Jewish children in a cellar on the outskirts, without water or bread. The youngest ones are still babies. Their fate, their whimpering, shook the residents of Balazha Zerkov, including the family of Anna Protas.
When my father came home, he was deathly pale. He was weeping. He said, "I heard the children scream, 'Mama,' at the top of their voice. They were shouting, 'Mama, Mama.' It's still ringing in my ears." He broke down and cried.
The SS shoot their mothers and fathers. What is to become of the children?
First, they fetched the men. They were told they're being taken to work, but they never returned. Then they fetched the women, without their children. The women didn't return either. Then the children had to watch as their mothers were shot, right before their eyes. And then it was the children's turn.
They are brought to an orphanage and are shot soon after. An officer wants to stop the massacre. He approaches his superior, the commander of the 6th Army, Field Marshal von Reichenau. He is a modern general who regards child murder as expedient. Shortly afterwards, he commands his troops.
In the eastern region, the soldier is not only a fighter according to the rules of the art of war, he also supports an uncompromising national idea.
They call it the command of hardship. Men who do this are promoted by Hitler. The man who succeeds Reichenau as commander of the 6th Army is General Friedrich Paulus. Is he the right choice?
I suppose Paulus was a good teacher at the War Academy, a great theorist. But he wasn't a proper army commander. He was a fatalist, hesitant. It was often only through his chief of general staff, General Schmidt, who pushed him, that he ever came to a decision.
Paulus wants to have nothing to do with war crimes. But he is resigned to fighting Hitler's war, and he is ordered to advance on the Volga with the 6th Army. The code name is Operation Blue. The offensive makes speedy progress. The Germans advance more than 1,000 kilometers in only a few weeks, but fresh supplies don't follow them, and many officers begin to have pangs of doubt.
For heaven's sake, what were we doing? We were rushing the army headlong to its doom. It had to go wrong. It couldn't succeed. Because, of course, higher up, Paulus couldn't find anyone who'd take what he said into consideration. They were thinking, if we continue being pessimistic, we'll be one of those pessimistic generals to an even greater degree, and tomorrow we'll be replaced, and so on. In hindsight, it's easy to sit here in an armchair and say, well, then I'd have let myself be replaced. But the kind of man to say that is, I suppose, someone other than Paulus.
Hitler doesn't want to hear about the uncertainty among his generals. The Führer doesn't accept that there are problems with fresh supplies. He feels that the military campaign isn't progressing quickly enough. Ever since the beginning of the war in the East, he wants to conquer everything simultaneously: the oil wells in the Caucasus and Stalin City on the Volga. So Hitler divides his forces. The main body of the troops, Military Unit A, tries to seize the oil fields at Baku. Military Unit B marches toward Stalingrad. The generals are skeptical. The front is too long and their strength is waning. Hitler considers himself an infallible commander. Chief of General Staff Franz Halder is having second thoughts, but to no effect.
He had a fit of rage. Despite everyone advising against it, he tore the operation apart and aimed one fist at Stalingrad and the other at the Caucasus. Ask any army man if he thinks that's right, and he'll tell you, no.
No one drew any conclusions, not even Halder.
Most of the generals went there, allowed themselves to be humiliated, went back home, and then to the front again. They were pleased. Hitler told them, take 4 weeks leave, and when you get back, I'll call you. So, they were more or less like football trainers. They were brought back every 6 months, even after they'd been sacked.
Hitler's plan seems to be working out. The advance on the Caucasus is progressing well. The oil fields are within grasp, and there is already talk of a new blitzkrieg. The armed forces reach Maikop on the 9th of August 1942, but the conquerors arrive too late. The oil fields are already burning. Hitler's advance in the south breaks down.
The Russians set their own oil fields alight so that they could keep them from us. I think the Russians knew about our poor provision of supplies, because we soon heard that there was no fuel. We had no fuel for our tanks. In fact, the entire division had no fuel for the vehicles. My division, for example, was only 60 kilometers away from Baku, from the oil fields, but we didn't have enough fuel to travel 60 kilometers.
They never reached the oil fields of Baku. Instead, they conquer a mountain, Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus, which makes no military sense. It's just an adventure for the climbers and an annoyance for Hitler.
How can you waste your time on such childishness? The soldiers should have been court-martialed and sentenced to death. But let's leave that aside. If they had let me know that the oil wells in Maikop or Grozny were working again, things would have been different.
The war for oil has been lost. While the tanks are stuck in the Caucasus, the 6th Army is advancing further towards Stalinggrad.
The Russians can shoot as much as they like. We only shoot more. It's a joke when a few hundred Russians attack. We're looking forward to our attack, which will hopefully be soon. They'll be in for it then.
There's movement on the horizon. We look again. Movement, but we can't make out what it is. Then we move a little closer, about 500 meters or a kilometer. You've got to picture this wide expanse, this incredibly fascinating plain. And we can make out that they're camels. Not only 3, but about 80 or 90.
They take a while to let themselves be discovered, not quite voluntarily.
This is quite something for our soldiers. The captured camels are immediately employed as pack animals.
Because there's no fuel, the march to Stalinggrad grinds to a halt.
Our tanks were parked. We still had a little fuel for us to move, of course, but we didn't have enough to launch an attack. It wasn't even enough fuel for one day. A tank regiment uses, I don't have the figures handy, but it uses a lot of fuel per day. If you think that there were 200 tanks that could still advance, we had enough ammunition for at least one attack on Stalinggrad. But we still had a difficult battle to face, and we didn't have enough ammunition for that. In other words, there was a real breakdown in our supply network. We could only advance on Stalinggrad 3 weeks later than originally planned. At least, our unit, our division could.
Crucial days are lost. Then comes the surprise. The armed forces advance into a void. The Red Army retreats, leaving villagers and other people to an uncertain fate.
Yes, we had to run from the cities and villages. Many people came with us. Those who stayed behind reproached us and said, "How can you do this? It's a disgrace. And yes, we were ashamed. That's why we tried to avoid towns and villages and traveled along remote roads and across fields so that we didn't have to face the people who had to stay behind. We abandoned them.
In Stalingrad, no one had any idea what was about to happen to the city. The metropolis on the Volga is known as a model socialist city, famous for armaments and traffic on road and river. It has 450,000 inhabitants, 5 high schools, and 3 theaters. The city stretches for 30 kilometers along the Volga.
It was a beautiful city. There were multi-storied buildings in the center, 4, 5-storied buildings, and on the outskirts there were family homes, as well as the so-called merchants' houses, double or triple-storied houses. They were very well kept, and most important was, the city was very green.
The original name was Zarazin. According to legend, this is where Stalin salvaged the revolution during the Civil War.
I found everything I wanted in this city. The opportunity to learn, the opportunity to recover my health, the opportunity to fish. The Volga was very rich in fish, you see.
In Moscow, the commanders feared that the fall of Stalingrad could affect the outcome of the war. Stalin wants to hold the city which bears his name at all costs. On the 19th of July, he orders the Defense Committee to prepare his city for a state of war. Stalingrad, packed with refugees, is converted into a fortress. The residents must stay here, even with danger coming closer every day. In spite of neglect and a lack of supplies, the 6th Army bursts into Stalingrad. The German soldiers are confident of victory, and many are already looking forward to their holiday at home.
We believed that if we could isolate Stalingrad, and with it, the Volga, the war was in effect as good as over. Perhaps one still had to advance on Moscow from the south. But as far as we were concerned, the conquest of Stalingrad and the closure of the Volga as a line of supply meant the war was practically over.
The war has reached the homeland by now. Cities are bombarded more and more frequently. More and more, families must say goodbye to their fathers because they've got to go to war in the East and rarely come home. Tank driver Gerhard Kollek from Allenstein in East Prussia is on leave from the Russian front.
It was the loveliest time that summer, a wonderful holiday. We had perfect weather, very good weather. We went on many outings.
Gerhard Kollek rejoins the 6th Army in the summer of 1942.
Then telegram came after telegram, ordering, back to the army immediately. I didn't give him the first one. I hid it. I didn't want to let him go. The next day, there was another one. Back to the army immediately. I had to give it to him. Otherwise, they would have fetched him. And he didn't want to die like that either, being fetched and shot as a coward.
She will never see him again. On the 23rd of August, the leading tanks reach their target. The Volga, north of Stalingrad.
It was an overwhelming sight. Below us was the enormously wide flood of the Volga, and on the opposite side, this low riverbank which stretched to eternity, to the furthest horizon. We were standing in Europe, looking at Asia.
Our division has been refused winter clothing. Please, God, dear ones, that I see you again this year. If Stalingrad falls, the Russian Southern Army will be destroyed.
A silence, so that you don't believe you're in the midst of a war. It was the calm before the storm, we said. One of our comrades had a beautiful voice. And it's giving me goose flesh now. He sang the Song of the Volga. It gave us cold shivers. How should I say? Whenever I hear the Song of the Volga now, cold shivers run down my spine.
The Song of the Volga from the operetta The Tsarevich by Franz Lehr became the hit song of the 6th Army.
We didn't have much time to waste by standing and looking at this view towards Asia. We were being shot at by an anti-aircraft battery close by. So we had to attack and eliminate them. We did that. We charged full speed at this anti-aircraft division. And to our horror, we discovered that it was being operated by women.
Loringhoven's division is one of the first to admit that the steel ring around Stalingrad isn't so easy to penetrate, that the enemy is mobilizing all its forces, and that they even let women fight.
And at the time, this appeal came, an appeal to the soldiers. There is no land for us beyond the Volga. We knew before that we will neither cross the Volga nor retreat. We didn't need convincing. We knew that's the way it has to be. We knew what we were defending, our country, and most important, our city.
The German Air Force bombs the city till it's ready to be stormed. The same day that the German tanks reach the Volga, the Luftwaffe drops 41,600 bombs on Stalingrad.
I remember clearly. It was a Sunday afternoon, the 23rd of August, at exactly 8 minutes past 4. You could hear a rumble, a terrifying rumble from the left bank of the Volga. There were air formations. At first, we thought it was an exercise by our aircraft. But suddenly, we heard the whistling, and the explosions began.
The raid is the most severe strike so far on the Eastern Front.
I saw the city ahead of me, a flourishing city. We were the first to drop bombs there, because the other aircraft were deployed elsewhere. I had the impression that there was a huge industrial city below me. There were factories everywhere.
Thousands of tons of bombs turned the city into an inferno.
Stalingrad had to be annihilated because there were so many factories producing supplies for the Soviet army. That's why they all had to be wiped out. Every time we were given the command to target a different factory.
Residential areas are destroyed too. 40,000 people die in Stalingrad during the first week of bombing.
A huge black cloud of smoke hung over Stalingrad, and the thermal pressure weighed down on it, so that the cloud of smoke formed an enormous cross. At the time, we saw it as virtually a tombstone for Stalingrad. No one had an inkling yet that it would be the tombstone of the Sixth Army.
Only now are the people allowed to leave the city.
Everything collapsed before our eyes. I lived on the bank of the Volga, about a kilometer from the city center. For the most part, the city was being bombed, and when the first explosion came, I realized, this is it. There is no turning back. A terrible new time awaits us.
Day after day, the German bombers strike. The city soon looks like a heap of rubble. The entry in a Stalingrad girl's diary reads as follows.
September the 4th. They've been bombing us for 2 weeks, even though there's almost nothing left to bomb. Will we survive all this? I'm scared. They're building barricades everywhere. Apparently, the real nightmare is still to come.
German soldiers march into Stalingrad on the 13th of September. Many citizens are surprised by their first contact with the attackers.
I saw some handsome men marching there. They looked like Olympic athletes. They carried themselves upright and had no devilish horns as the children and even we had imagined. They looked good and were quite friendly, really.
The troops are there to break down the last resistance, and they believe the job is done. But the real battle of Stalingrad is only beginning now.
Fighting in the buildings in Stalingrad itself was new to us. That's why there were so many losses, because we lacked experience.
This is warfare in a wilderness of rubble and devastation. The enemy is invisible and everywhere.
It's a fight for a house, where death lurks behind every corner. You can't imagine a situation more frightening and more horrible than that.
A German general writes to a friend.
Attacks coming from cellars, from hidden bunkers and ruins lead to heavy losses among our troops.
He runs across the battle zone with shots ringing out and with ricocheting bullets and so on. I yelled, "Schappel, get down, quickly! Schappel, hurry! They're firing!" Suddenly, he goes down into a bomb crater. He'd been shot in the back. It had ripped open his left shoulder, and where the bullet exited on the right, everything was torn open. The air from his lungs was blowing out there. He said, "Well, Helmut, the war's over now." And I said, "Yes, Schappel, the war is over. I promise I'll fetch you tonight. I promise. Lie here quietly and I'll send the first aid people to you. You're very seriously wounded. Can you hear the air from your lungs?" "Yes," he said.
The first aid workers arrive too late. Regiments turn into units of shock troops. They call it the War of Rats. One wrong move can be fatal.
When fighting in the buildings, we came across all sorts of things. Where Russians were sitting in the cellar, our men were on the first and the second floor. But then there were Russians on the top floor again. Oh, we often saw that in the remaining solid buildings.
Every building became a fortress in the devastated city. Tanks and artillery can play no part in the battle among the rubble. Buildings are taken with machine guns and hand grenades.
The stronger ones among us could throw the grenades 10 to 15 meters up into the buildings. They exploded. Then the Germans opened fire, and their aim was pretty good.
Regardless of losses, Red Army soldiers were forced to attack.
Our company commander, Babachkov, gave the order. Look carefully at the rooms on the first floor, right in the middle. Try driving them out with grenades first. If they jump out of the windows, we'll kill them down here. But they were stubborn. They carried on shooting. Then another grenade, and yet another. Eventually, only one German was still firing and wouldn't let us in. The daredevils turned up. They crept up close to the building, and we saw them charge it from the courtyard. Then it was quiet. It was our turn. We didn't take prisoners in cases like this. There was no hands up. But the German fired and was paid back in the same way.
This is the most brutal form of war. In hand-to-hand combat, man against man, the battle becomes a massacre. This is how they fought in previous centuries, steel on steel.
When the Russians suddenly jumped into our trenches, there was only one thing to do: grab a spade and hit in such a way that you struck right here, below the head, cutting the artery and put them out of action.
In this war, no weapons are barred, even the flamethrower. There was growing despair on the Russian side too.
These will be the last words I write you. You'll never see me again. We're parting forever. Somehow I've become indifferent, and I'm not really afraid to die. Sorry if I'm causing you pain. If only I could see you one more time.
Newcomers to the front cannot cope with the hell of Stalinggrad.
After 2 or 3 days, I noticed that these young men were no match for what was happening. They came back, and they were mentally disturbed. They laid down their arms. They had cracked up. They spoke mindlessly. Mindlessly. To put it mildly, they'd gone mad.
The pictures on the weekly newsreel show a different war. Young soldiers, well cared for during a ceasefire. Reality is different. They are badly neglected and absolutely exhausted.
The longer you're out there as a soldier, the more deadened you become. You switch off. What do you do if the man next to you in the trench gets a direct hit, possibly a grenade, and where the man had been, not a shred is left? The grenade or the artillery missile might have exploded in his body, and then only shreds fly about. That is war. That's what war looks like, and that's the truth.
Dear ones, at last I've arrived at Europe's river of fate. You'll be astonished to hear that the city which has been the object of such fierce fighting is still not in our hands. The Russians are still holding out, but not for long. The decision can come any day now. You can count yourself lucky every day that you don't get hurt. By the time you get this letter, the special news flash about Stalingrad's fall will have come through. How simple a piece of news like that sounds in the peace and quiet of home. But only those who have experienced something similar will ever know what goes with a report like that. How many victims were sacrificed? How many best friends were lost?
The weekly newsreel is determined to report the fall of Stalingrad.
The southern part of the city is firmly in German hands. Our soldiers are hoisting the swastika above an area that was fiercely fought over.
On the 6th of October 1942, Paulus calls off the attack temporarily. The troops are not prepared for the winter. They're badly neglected and cannot even hold a completely conquered Stalingrad. Hitler orders total appropriation of the city. For him, the battle has long since become a question of prestige.
Because it was Stalin's city, Stalingrad. That was the point, exactly. That the dictator on the other side was saying, the city bearing my name will not be taken. Then the two dictators get stuck into it and sacrificed endless numbers of people to an end, which is, speaking in ideological and military terms, absurd.
There are immense losses on both sides. Time is blood. That is the motto of the defender. Hitler's chief of the general staff has warned that the front is overstretched, the losses are too high. In the coming winter, catastrophe threatens.
Darauf tobte Hitler
went into a rage and bellowed at Halder. How dare you judge what one can expect from soldiers and officers? During the First World War, you sat in your swivel chair in General Staff, and that's where you've been this time. I have experience at the front. I know you can expect soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers to be willing to die. It's a matter of honor.
Hitler's helper, Halder, is dismissed. The senseless killing continues. The Red Army loses 2,500 men every day. This footage is shot in a Soviet hospital. The Germans don't let cameras into their hospitals. People suffer equally on both sides.
The men lay there. Many of them couldn't move their hands. So when they were discharged, they weren't able to button up their trousers. They wet their pants. They soiled themselves without even noticing. Amazingly, I didn't smell it, even though it must have stank to high heaven. I'd gotten used to it. But when I walked into the cellar with 2 Red Army soldiers and told them this was a hospital, where there were many sick people, the soldiers reeled from the dreadful stench.
Stalingrad has become a city of horror and terror, a city of rubble and ashes. The entire working-class district and the factories have been burnt to the ground. Terror is still etched on the faces of the people. They've been made homeless.
In the city, this hole in the ground is where 6-year-old Lydia Arazkaya and her family live. They've lost everything, but they're still alive.
One day, my father opened the cover of our trench and asked the neighbor who was living in a hole in the ground next door to us, "Are you still alive? Are you still alive? Come out. The whole area was level with the ground. There were no more houses standing. When my father opened the cover, the sniper saw him. At that moment, he collapsed. He hadn't even finished his sentence. He said, "Are you still?" The bullet hit him in the right temple.
The invisible threat of the sniper lurks everywhere in the ruins of Stalinggrad. A man called Zikan is said to have shot 224 Germans by the middle of November. Russians hail him as a hero. Gaja Shokolov wants to be a sniper too.
It was like this. After 3 days, someone said to me, "You're slit-eyed, so you should be able to shoot well. Get a sniper's rifle." So I fetched one. 4 of us were walking along the bank of the Volga. We had to shoot at the insulators on the telegraph poles. I hit 2 out of 3. The others, only 1 each. On the second day, I hit 3, and the others none at all. The commander told me, "You're a sharpshooter now."
Sharpshooters like Gaja Shokolov keep their adversaries in constant fear.
Did we regard the German as a human being in those days? No. I had no problem killing them. If a vehicle was moving, I tried to hit the driver. I aimed a little further ahead. I couldn't see the driver, but the vehicle would stop. So
The Germans are living targets.
then a steel helmet came flying through the air. That was the first time I saw a human brain. The forehead had been split open right down the middle. I saw the left and the right brain and water. No blood. I saw him look at me, then fall down, face into the dirt.
The Russians have remarkable sharpshooters. God help me that I may never become their target. We're freezing, but it's not even winter yet. What will happen in winter if they leave us here? Help us, Holy Mary, to get back home.
The writer of that letter was fatally wounded soon after.
Death comes in so many different ways. It can be as merciful as a well-directed headshot. The head falls, and one might almost think the soldier has laid down to sleep.
The mighty Volga, river of fate. The soldiers of the 6th Army are now cursing this river that they couldn't reach quickly enough.
Entweder verwundet oder tot.
We understood that was how we'd end up. We were at the places of execution. We'd spoken about it. We sang the song of the Volga once. Everyone wept. You were a young man, proud, 20 years old, and then you were executed in this manner.
There were once 1,200 men in Helmut Waltz's regiment. In mid-October 1942, only 60 are still fit to fight. By the middle of October, most of Stalinggrad has been taken in bloody fighting, and the armaments industry is completely destroyed. But Soviet units are still holding narrow strips along the Volga. None of the German attackers expected such dogged resistance.
The commanded respect. Our opponents had pulled themselves together. They were in a hopeless situation because they were 150 meters from the Volga and they were defending themselves. We couldn't get any further. That was it. We couldn't get any further.
But Hitler is already celebrating his conquest of the city that bears his enemy's name. The Löwenbräu Keller in Munich on the 8th of November 1942.
I wanted to reach the Volga at a specific point in a specific city. It happens to bear Stalin's name. But don't think that's why I marched over there. It might have been called anything else. You know, we're modest people. We've got it, you see. There are only a few tiny places left. No ship can go up the Volga anymore. And that's the crucial thing.
He couldn't care less about the dying in Stalingrad. He has committed himself. The day after, the mercury in Stalingrad drops to minus 18 degrees. Winter has come. The Volga freezes over. In the expanse of the steppes, the plains between the Don and the Volga, something even worse is lurking just over the horizon. The Sixth Army's flanks are vulnerable. On the 19th of November, the Soviets attack with more than 1 million men and slip a noose round the city. The Sixth Army is trapped. The Stalingrad victory was built on sand.
Blessed are they who gain ground by retreat, as they will see their homeland again. We young ones knew where the hair runs to.
Hitler hears about the noose around the Sixth Army on the 22nd of November. His decision is made on the same day.
When he heard that Stalingrad was boxed in, he immediately ordered that the city was to be held at all costs.
He has just handed down a death sentence for the Sixth Army. The German invaders will be sacrificed in the Kessel of Stalingrad.